It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you to talk about new work that we're doing in our research group on changing opportunity. So let me set the stage for this talk by turning to this map here, which I think some of you may have seen, but for others who may not have seen it, let me take a second to describe what it shows on the geography of economic mobility in America and why I think it sets the stage for the conversations you all are having today. So in this map, from a paper my colleagues and I released now 10 years ago on the land of opportunity, we set about to assess the geography of economic mobility in America. And the way we did that is using a big data approach. So we took data on essentially all kids born in the United States around 1980, linked them back to their parents using information from anonymized tax returns, and divided the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, using information from tax records, we calculated a simple measure of upward mobility. We asked, what is your average income when you're 35 years old, as reported on your 1040 tax return, if you grew up in a low-income family? And I'm going to define, for the purposes of this talk, a low-income family as a family making $27,000 a year, which puts you at the 25th percentile of the US national income distribution. So we take the set of kids growing up in those low-income families in each of these different areas. So for example, in the Boston metro area where I'm from, kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year, you can see on average, they were making $36,800 a year when we look at their tax filings at age 35. And we similarly construct that statistic for all of the other different metro and rural areas. We color the map so that red colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. Green colors represent places with higher levels of upward mobility where you're more likely to achieve the American dream in some sense. You can see if you look at the scale on the lower right-hand side that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up across different parts of the United States. In some parts of the US, like in Dubuque, Iowa, much of the center of the country, you have great chances of rising up. Kids born to families making $27,000 a year, on average, one generation later, are making $45,000 or $50,000 a year, a substantial amount of upward mobility in a single generation. Yet there are other places like Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, and much of the Southeast, where you have much lower rates of upward mobility. Kids growing up in families at the exact same income level, one generation later, are actually making less than their parents were on average, which is kind of remarkable if you think about the tremendous amount of economic growth that has occurred in the past 30 years. So when we put out these data publicly, they generated a fair bit of interest in various parts of the country. To take one example from Charlotte, that'll be relevant to the context of the panel discussion we're going to have in a second, Charlotte was ranked 50th out of the 50 largest American cities in terms of rates of upward mobility. And that generated a lot of concern and I think motivation there to try to make changes that Sherry and others will discuss in a second. And lots of policymakers around the country approached us asking, what can we do to improve economic mobility in our own cities and expand economic opportunity? And that question and this map has essentially been on my mind for the past 10 years, trying to understand what are the determinants of economic mobility, what is the science of economic opportunity, how can we make progress on these issues? Now, at the same time that we put out these data and we're starting to talk with folks on the ground, like many of yourselves, on how we can change economic opportunity, the academic literature was also progressing using these data that we had released publicly to try to understand what drove these differences. And one of the key findings to emerge is that the roots of these differences have strong historical origins. Their history casts a very long shadow. So to give you an example, here's a subsequent paper by a demographer named Thor Berger, who took our data and compared it to data on rates of slavery back in 1860. And you can see a remarkable resemblance between those two things. It's exactly in the places with the highest rates of slavery in 1860 that you have the lowest levels of economic mobility in present-day America. Another example related to the panel you just had with Andre Perry and the nice work that folks have done on the importance of credit. Here's another historical policy, redlining back in the 1930s. You can see now at the local neighborhood level, exactly the neighborhoods that were redlined denied credit access back in the 1930s in the Bay Area are precisely the places that have the lowest levels of upward mobility in Oakland, for example, in present-day America. And so these kinds of findings, and there are many more like this, suggests that history really casts a very long shadow. This is a slow-moving process where the historical legacy of slavery and other discriminatory practices might be affecting upward mobility in present-day America. And so seeing those findings, I felt concerned about the conversations I was having with policymakers and people wanting to change opportunity, because when you look at this sort of data, you start to wonder, if we're thinking about factors going back to 1860, is it really feasible that we're going to see change in the types of timeframes that policymakers often focus on, in 5, 10 years, things like that. And so motivated by that, the focus of our current research at Opportunity Insights, our team at Harvard, is to try to understand whether we can, in fact, change opportunity. And so what I'm going to present today is some data from a new paper that we'll be releasing in a few weeks that gives us, I think, some hope and some new insight into how opportunity might be changeable despite the fact that history casts a very long shadow. So what makes this new work feasible is basically the gift of time. In the past 10 years, 10 years have elapsed, the data we had available at that time from the tax records only allowed us to study kids who were born in the late 1970s. They were old enough so that we could see their incomes in adulthood. You have to wait till people are in their late 20s till you can get a reasonable, reliable measure of their incomes. Now 10 years have passed. That means we have 10 more birth cohorts of data. We can start to look at mobility for kids who were born more recently. And so what I'm going to show you is some new analysis where we look at changes in outcomes for children born between 1978, going back to that map that I started out with, up to kids born in 1992, whose incomes we're measuring right around now, just before the pandemic. This is going to be the first look that anyone has had on how economic opportunity can change across places in the United States over time. And it's going to give us new insight, in particular, into these trends by race, class, and gender. So let me start by going back to this map here, which is showing you the data on economic mobility, exactly the same kinds of statistics I started out with, for kids born now back in 1978. And I'm going to start first by focusing on white kids born in low-income families, families at the 25th percentile. And if you look at that map, now constructed at the county level, you can see a spatial pattern that looks very similar to the one that I started out with on the first map. So now what we can do with the newly available data is replicate this map for kids born in 1992. And what do you see? You can see that the red colors that we saw in much of the Southeast have basically spread across the United States. So there were some parts of America where kids from, white kids from low-income families had pretty good chances of rising up. Like if you look at California, for example, or parts of the Northeast back in 1978, they had decently high rates of upward mobility. But by the time you look at the 1992 birth cohort, just 15 years later, their chances of upward mobility in those places look like they do in much of Appalachia, the Southeast, and so on. So that's the picture for white kids. Economic mobility is receding. Your chances of rising up have fallen. Now, the striped areas, the dashed black lines, you mean? Yeah, so that's basically where you don't have enough data to be able to compute these changes reliably. Thanks for clarifying that. And that's going to become a much more important phenomenon when I turn to the data for Black Americans, where there are many parts of the country where you don't have large Black populations, as you know, so we're going to have that data for a smaller subset of areas. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the same pair of maps for Black Americans. I'm going to change the spectrum of the color scale here for a reason that will become clear in a second. We're going to start by showing you the data again for kids born in 1978. Here, the purple colors denote areas with the lowest levels of upward mobility. The peach-orange colors are the places with the highest levels of upward mobility for Black Americans. And so now let's look at what happens in 1992. You can see that the map turns more orange. Upward mobility is generally increasing for Black Americans quite significantly over the past 15 years. So that is good news. There's progress in terms of upward mobility. However, I want to emphasize one extremely important point, which is that while there's positive change, there is still an enormous gap in terms of rates of upward mobility between Black and white Americans, as we've documented in earlier research. And just to make that very salient to you, let me bring back the color scale that we used for the maps for white folks on the previous slide. And what you can see is that color spectrum is basically completely non-overlapping with the data for Black folks. So that is to say, even in the 1992 birth cohort, the very best places for upward mobility for Black Americans still have lower rates of upward mobility than the worst places for upward mobility for white Americans. So there's progress being made. I think we're headed in the right direction, but there's a lot of ground that remains to be closed. So now, just to give you some data, I've been showing you these pictures, how these things are evolving spatially. To summarize what we're seeing at the national level, let me turn to this table here that basically shows you the data for 4 groups: Black folks, white folks, growing up in low-income families, and high-income families. So let's start with Black kids born to low-income parents in the 25th percentile of the income distribution. You can see that those kids' incomes, when we measure them in their late 20s, have gone up by about $1,400 per year. That's relative to an average income of something like $25,000 a year around that time. So it's about, think of it as something like a 6-7% increase. At the same time, white kids' incomes have been falling by $2,000 between the 1978 and 1992 birth cohorts. That's the falling upward mobility for low-income white kids. If you put those two patterns together, the Black-white gap, the racial gap in economic mobility, it started out at $13,000. So a Black kid and a white kid born to families at the same income level, the white kids were earning about $13,000 more in their late 20s than Black kids. That racial gap has shrunk to about $9,500 over 15 birth cohorts, about a 30% reduction. At the same time, if you look at white kids growing up in high-income families, their incomes have gone up on average by $770. And so if you do this comparison, compare the outcomes of white children born to low-income parents versus high-income parents, basically how important is class in America in determining outcomes, that gap has increased by 30%. So class, the level of your parents' income, is becoming a more and more important determinant of how well kids end up doing. And finally, if we look at the 4th box here, Black kids growing up to high-income parents, we see that their outcomes are going up as well. So for Black children across the board, you're seeing an improvement in outcomes. For white children growing up in high-income families, you're seeing better outcomes. But for low-income families, you're seeing worse outcomes, okay? So that's the summary of what's happening at a high level. Now, one final point in terms of the key national trends that we're seeing in these new data, the progress that we're seeing for Black children is predominantly in escaping poverty into the middle class. So to show you that clearly, let's focus on a simple measure of the persistence of poverty across generations, which arguably is, I think, one of the most concerning things in society. So what we're measuring here is take the set of kids born to families in the bottom 5th of the income distribution and ask what fraction of them remain in the bottom 5th in the next generation. For what fraction does poverty persist across generations? You can see that back in 1978, for the children born in 1978, for white kids, that number was 25%. 25% of white kids born to families at that lowest income level ended up having very low incomes in the next generation. For Black kids, it was tremendously higher at 40%, much more intergenerational persistence of poverty for Black Americans than white Americans. What does that look like for kids born in 1992? You can see the picture has changed quite significantly. The intergenerational persistence of poverty has increased significantly for white children. It has fortunately fallen quite significantly for Black Americans. Black kids are more likely to be escaping poverty. They're not trapped in poverty in the next generation. So that is the good news. The bad news, once again underscoring the progress that remains to be made, is if we look at a different measure of economic mobility, we ask not what is your chance of escaping poverty, but rather what is your chance of reaching the top 5th of the income distribution, the upper middle class. The way I think about it is, what is your chance of sort of being in a room like this, of becoming a successful professional, et cetera? If you look at that front, look at the orange bars here, you can see that number is basically not changed at all for Black Americans from 1978 to 1992. So the way to think about what's happening is We're making progress in terms of people rising out of the most dire conditions into the middle class, but not in terms of breaking into, the more comfortable upper class of society, the types of positions that you might aspire for folks to have. And so I think much remains to be done there. So in the remaining time, I've shown you these data on how things are changing. I want to now talk about why this is happening. Why are we seeing these significant changes in opportunity? What can we learn from that on how we can change opportunity further going forward, which is, of course, what we're all here to talk about. So the focus of this paper that we'll be putting out is trying to answer exactly that question. Why is economic mobility changing so much by race and class? And so I'm going to briefly summarize what we find here in the interest of time. We investigated a number of different explanations that had been suggested in prior work, that people have discussed in popular discussions. So for example, some folks have suggested that maybe changes in family level factors, things like trends in marital status or levels of education or levels of wealth, maybe that explains why we're seeing these differences in outcomes by race and class. Turns out when you control for all of those factors, the picture looks almost identical to what I just showed you. So that's not what's going on. Another hypothesis you might have is that maybe this is about different things happening in different places. So maybe Black folks are living in cities or in labor markets where the economy is improving relative to where lower income white folks are living. Would have been a plausible explanation ex ante. Turns out if you look at a Black kid and a white kid growing up in exactly the same neighborhood, basically the same block, you still see these divergent trends. So this is not about differences across areas. This is about differences that are emerging within areas. And so the change, the bottom line is, has to be driven by differences by race and class within areas for kids who grow up in families with similar characteristics. So what could that be? We turned to the literature and drew inspiration from a scholar who I'm sure a number of you know, William Julius Wilson, who I see as really setting the foundation for the role of place and neighborhoods in understanding economic issues and racial disparities. And to read a line from his famous 1996 book on the disappearance of work, William Julius Wilson said, that based on his ethnographic work on the south side of Chicago, talking to Black families and discussing the challenges they faced on the south side of Chicago, he said, many of today's problems, crime, family dissolution, welfare, low levels of social organization, and so on, might fundamentally be the consequence of a disappearance of work. So basically his hypothesis was that when there are no jobs, that has lots of other downstream effects that might limit opportunities for people to thrive. And so motivated by that hypothesis, what we did is basically went back to the data and think of it as like a big data analysis using 57 million observations rather than Bill Wilson's focus on Chicago in particular, to ask whether that hypothesis seems to hold in the national data, not just for Black folks, but for white folks as well, by class and so on. And here's what you get. So what we're plotting here is the change in kids' outcomes from 1978 to 1992, the change in economic mobility that I was showing you on those maps, focusing first here on white kids growing up in low-income families. And we're plotting that data from the maps on changes in economic mobility versus changes in parental employment rates in the counties where those kids were growing up. And you can see that there's a very strong relationship here. The white kids who are growing up in counties where there's more of a decline in employment in the parents' generation are the ones whose outcomes are declining the most. If you grew up in a county where employment didn't fall that much, your economic outcomes didn't change that much across these cohorts, very much consistent with Wilson's hypothesis. So that's the data for white kids growing up in low-income families. Now let's look at the data for Black kids growing up in low-income families. You can see exactly the same relationship. It's just shifted over to the right. What's happening is that Black parents are experiencing more positive changes in employment in the US as a whole relative to white folks. And so that's why the data are shifted over to the right. But you see exactly that same relationship, that Black kids have better outcomes if they're growing up in places where employment rates are going up. And then finally, if you look at white kids growing up in high-income families, the third group where we have adequate data to do this analysis, you again see exactly the same relationship. So if you put a line through all of these data, you see kind of a remarkable pattern. The entire set of changes that you see in the United States by race and by class across areas is completely explained by changes in employment rates in the prior generation, exactly consistent with Wilson's hypothesis. Now, you might wonder, okay, is this being driven by employment at the community level, which is what we're measuring here? Or is it just that if your own parents lose their job, that has bad effects? That would make sense intuitively. And maybe it's that direct effect that's generating this relationship. Turns out that's not what's going on. If you now look at the subset of kids whose own parents stay employed throughout this period, so your parents are keeping their job, but you're growing up in a community where lots of people are losing their jobs, that is associated with much worse outcomes for kids. And conversely, if you're growing up in an area where employment rates are going up, then you see much better outcomes for those kids. So it's not about, this is the first piece of evidence of a really critical point, it's not just about what's happening in your family, it's about what's happening in your community, in the place where you're growing up, in particular in your race and class group. Now, why is this happening? One potential explanation is that the changes in labor markets that are affecting the parents, maybe they're also affecting the kids directly. To give you a simple example, say the local manufacturing plant closes in your town, the parents in that town lose their jobs. You were hoping to get a job in that same steel plant, say. Now you can't get that job. You were hoping to follow in your parents' footsteps, and your own outcomes look worse. That would be kind of a direct mechanism through which changes in employment rates in the parents' generation might be correlated with changes in your own outcomes. A different hypothesis is that there's actually a causal effect of growing up in a community where fewer people are working. This is more the idea that Wilson had in mind, that there's an environmental exposure effect from growing up in a place where fewer people are working, where there are other societal changes that may be unfavorable. So to disentangle those two things, we can do an analysis where we look at kids who move across different counties. So let me explain the logic of that in this slide here. Let's first look at kids who moved to a place where employment rates were, moved to a place with changing employment rates when they were relatively young. Okay, so say you moved there before you were age 8. And do the same kind of plot that we were doing before. We can see that if you got there at a young age, if you went to a place where employment rates were going up, you tended to have better outcomes in adulthood. Now, if you repeat that same analysis for kids who moved to those places when they were teenagers, you see basically no connection between their outcomes and the changes in employment rates in the place to which they moved. So what is that telling you? If it was just about the steel plant closing, the correlated labor demand shock, you would expect to see the chart on the right also show a positive upward slope, right? Because you're there as a teenager, you're also going to be affected by that lack of jobs. It should affect your outcomes. But that is not what's going on. You can see that it's only the kids who are exposed to those places with lower levels of employment for many years while they're growing up that you see these effects. More generally, there's sort of a dosage effect that you see in the data. The more years you spend growing up in a weaker environment, as proxied by levels of parental employment, for example, the worse your outcomes look in adulthood. So this really seems like an environmental exposure effect while you're growing up, which tells us something about the types of policy solutions we should be focused on. It's not just directly about jobs themselves, it's about what's happening while kids are growing up that's really important. That is further embodied by the fact that if we look at other data, for example, kids' SAT scores at the end of high school, you can see that if you grow up in an area with increasing employment rates, you see positive trends in SAT scores. So obviously this can't just be about the jobs that kids are getting. Things are changing on their trajectory while they're growing up. So last set of data, one final piece of this analysis. So we've seen that growing up in a community with higher parental employment rates, really seems like the key driver of these big changes we're seeing by race and class. Why is that? So one hypothesis is that it's about social interaction. So there are many plausible reasons that growing up in a community where more folks are working, where they have better jobs, might improve your own outcomes through things like job referrals, through things like changes in aspirations. If you've never met anyone who's gone to college or worked in a certain career, maybe you never think about that possibility yourself. A different story is that it's about economic resources. So obviously in a community where more people are working, have higher incomes, there's going to be more funding for local programs, more funding for schools. Maybe that's what's leading to these better outcomes for kids. So both of those explanations seem equally plausible to me before looking at the data. To test between them, and again, get a sharper sense of what we need to do to improve mobility going forward, we turned to data exploiting differences in friendship patterns across groups, who people are interacting with. To give you a sense of how that works, let me start with this plot here, where we're plotting the share of friends that people have using data from Facebook in their own cohort, meaning born in the same year as you, versus born 2 years earlier, 2 years later, 4 years earlier, 4 years later, and so on. And you see a very intuitive pattern. This is looking at high school friendships. If you just introspect yourself, you probably knew more people in your own grade than you did 1 grade below, 1 grade above, 2 grades below, 2 grades above, and so on. You see that pattern, that decay pattern, very clearly in the data in terms of social interactions. So now what we do is ask whose parents' employment rates predict your own outcomes. Is it the parents of kids in your own grade, or the parents of kids in a grade below you, a grade above you, and so on? And that's what's shown in this data here in the green. And you can see that there's a remarkable resemblance between the impacts of parental employment rates for kids in your own grade versus a grade younger, a grade older, and so on, to the pattern of social interaction. So this looks much more like a social interaction story than an economic resources story, because if it was about economic resources, you wouldn't expect it to be the case that exactly the kids whose parents, the kids in your own grade, their parents' employment rates matter a lot more than kids who are a year older or a year younger. So this kind of data, as well as other data that our team has released previously, really makes us think that social capital and social interaction lies at the heart of increasing economic mobility going forward. Just to show you another piece of data that supports that view, on the left here in the slide is the map that I started out with on just differences in economic mobility across areas, pooling racial groups. On the right is a very different map. It's a map of what we call economic connectedness. So what we're asking here is, if you've got a set of low-income folks, again using Facebook data, take the set of folks with below median income on the Facebook platform and ask what fraction of their friends have above median income. So it's just a simple measure of how connected low-income people are to high-income people, county by county in America. In the map on the right, the green colors are counties with more cross-class interaction. Red colors are places with cross-class disconnection. And you can see the result for yourself immediately. The map on the right looks basically identical to the map on the left. It's exactly in the places with more cross-class interaction that you have higher levels of economic mobility. We've done further analysis which suggests that this is really a very important link. Cross-class interaction is a key driver of economic mobility. So putting it all together, what do we see from these new data, and what do I hope you'll take away? So the biggest takeaway for me was a positive one, just that opportunity can in fact change within relatively short periods, within a decade, within 15 years, despite the fact that the roots of a lot of the challenges we're all discussing today emerged 200 years ago. That doesn't mean that change is not possible. Change is feasible. I think we can all make a difference. Now, how can we increase mobility and reduce racial disparities going forward? I would focus on two key takeaways. First, focus on social communities within neighborhoods, not just neighborhoods as a whole, as the unit of change. So a lot of place-based work, if you think about going back to William Julius Wilson and others, that we need to revitalize neighborhoods, it focuses on the neighborhood as a unit of change. But what we're seeing here is what really matters is your social group. Who are you interacting with? Often divided by race and class lines, even within a neighborhood. Second, as I've just emphasized, I think providing social capital in addition to financial and human capital is really the key to creating more successful programs. And indeed, when we look at the data on the programs that seem most successful in a variety of different domains, from housing vouchers to job training to higher education, it's the programs that both give you money or give you some support and connect you with folks who can help you use those resources most effectively that seem to have the biggest impacts. Now, there's a lot more to be done in terms of figuring out exactly what interventions can be most effective. When we put out this new paper, we will also put out new data on rates of economic mobility and how they have changed in every county in America. And I'm just giving you a quick sneak preview here. One of the very interesting things you see is Charlotte, which I highlighted at the beginning as the city with the lowest level of economic mobility in America, turns out to be one of the places with the greatest improvement in the past 15 years. And really, mobility has increased, in particular for Black Americans in Charlotte, quite remarkably in the past 15 years. And I think seeing these data will help us better understand where we're making progress and where we need to do more going forward. I want to end with this chart here. So I've focused on these issues, and I think many of us come to these issues largely from the perspective of fairness, the idea that it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is in determining your opportunities in life. But I think there's also another reason that's very important that we care about Black economic progress, which is simply the fact that when people do better, it contributes to everyone doing better in society. And here's some data that underscores that point. In this study, we've linked data from patent records on who becomes an inventor to data on test scores for all kids who went to New York City public schools. And what you can see is if you look at kids who are scoring at the top of the test score distribution on the far right, if you're a white or Asian kid, you're very likely to become an inventor in adulthood. But if you're a Black or Hispanic kid doing equally well in third grade in terms of math, your odds of becoming an inventor are no higher than kids with much lower test scores. And so what that means is we basically have an important phenomenon of lost Einsteins in the US, where there are lots of kids who have the potential to come through the pipeline and make important innovations that will not only benefit them, but benefit all of us and increase economic growth. We estimate that if women, underrepresented minorities, and kids from low-income families were to invent at the same rate as high-income white men, we'd have 4 times as many inventors in America as we currently do. And that, of course, would transform all of our lives and improve our economy as a whole. And so in that sense, I think we all have a great deal to gain from Black economic progress, and I'm delighted that all of you are engaged on these issues. Thank you so much.